And we're live. So my name is Pete Rohrbaugh, and I'm a professor in the Digital Writing and Media Arts Department at Southern Polytechnic State University in Marietta, Georgia. I invited Rabia Chaudhry to have some conversation with me about the ongoing Serial podcast, which we'll be talking about the 6th episode of today. And I'm specifically interested in these conversations and the conversations that we've had leading up to this interview in the meta-narrative surrounding the show. So I'm going to be asking Rabia questions about her about how the construction of the story has affected how she views it, and how the story and a digital component has kind of like dragged her across different platforms and put her in kind of new collaborative environments that have moved kind of the case into a different, the case of Adnan Syed into a different kind of framework for her. So those are the reasons that I'm interested in continuing these conversations. I'm hoping that we're going to be able to have them every week. And I'll turn it over to Rabia for you to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Rabia Chaudhry, and if for people who have been following Serial, the podcast, they might recognize that I've been mentioned briefly a couple of times as the person who contacted Sarah Koenig about a year ago about the case, and I've essentially, been Adnan's family. I mean, they're family friends in terms of like his parents and my parents, but also he is my younger brother, is one of his closest friends for since high school, since they were freshmen, and I've known Adnan for about the same period of time too, since that time, and when you reached out to me about about just having a conversation about this, I wasn't quite sure it was going to. I mean, in all honesty, like I've gotten a lot of messages and emails and tweets and stuff. So, but for some reason, like your interest in it kind of captured my imagination, because I'm so in it, I'm not really thinking about kind of the meta questions. And I think after our first conversation last week, I realized there's a lot of stuff I'm not even thinking about, that I haven't thought about, and so I was just kind of intrigued, and I look forward to having these conversations.
Cool. I really appreciate your willingness to do that, Rabia. So we'll start with questions that have come out of kind of a general listening to the podcast over the last 4 or 5 weeks, and then we'll hone in specifically on a couple of questions that relate to the latest episode that's titled Root Talk. So Rabia, let's start this way. Can you talk a little bit about what kind of interaction you continue to have with Sarah's team? Anybody that's familiar with Serial will know that you're the person who introduced the story to Sarah Koenig and her production team. And you were featured in several of the pieces of the first episode, but obviously as the episode has unfolded, it's kind of like concentrated on specific parts of the case and Adnan's story, and you haven't been a resource in any of those episodes. Has their team stayed in touch with you? How much interaction do you have with them?
So I think, when I first kind of turned over the documents, and really I turned over the documents I had to Sarah early, like in our first meeting, pretty much, not all of them, but the ones she wanted, and then in I think the second meeting, pretty much all of them, and that was, about a year ago, and early on there was more, we were in touch much more because she had questions. She's like, well, who is this, and who is this, and how can I contact this person? There's a lot more questions. And then, as her investigation took off, the contact has been, basically to the extent of what, like, information she needs, and she's come by a couple times after that, because she has, and put me back on, the mic, because there's something she wants to tell me and get my reaction, or there's been that. So it's really been only as a resource to when she needs me for the story. Mm-hmm. Now, I actually didn't know, it wasn't until a couple of months ago, I think, that she mentioned that it was going to be like a series. I thought, This American Life does like their hour-long show. I thought it would be like a podcast. So I didn't know until not too long ago that was going to happen. And then I also had never heard a podcast before, and I had no idea that there's going to be this new program, serial. I never even heard the name until the first one went up.
Really?
Yeah, I had no idea. Sarah said, okay, our first show is coming up next week, and I just want you to know. And that was it. I said, okay.
Wow.
I had no idea. And what I realized is I was pretty naive because I went into this thinking when I contacted Sarah and she was interested, I'm like, oh my gosh, she's a journalist who thinks Adnan's innocent. It took time for me to realize she's a journalist who's interested in the layers of the story and the characters. Mm-hmm. And so, although there were times when I totally expected that I was going to be I actually remember when they were doing that drive that for Route Talk, and she came because I was in the neighborhood, and she had some questions for me, and she said, okay, now me and my whatever I co-produce, I don't know who was with her, or Dana, I guess, or whoever this is going to go do this ride, and I was like, oh, can I come too? And I think I didn't realize the distance that was happening. Right. She's like, yeah, and so that's when I was like, oh, I'm not getting this right. I'm forgetting where I am and where she is. So, but even recently, I think, since the show's come out, every so often, because I don't want to, I have obviously a lot of information and documents that they're being released in bits and pieces, mm-hmm. in terms of how they're framing, where they want the show to go next. Mm-hmm. I don't want to trump them. So every so often I might shoot them a text and say, listen, I was going to blog about this, or I was going to use, should I use this person's name or not? Because I don't want to mess up their work. But beyond that, I have no idea I can make educated guesses about what future episodes will contain. Like, I think there'll be an episode about his lawyer. Mm-hmm. But I have no idea. I have no idea who they interviewed. I don't know what happened to those interviews. And I don't know what the show's gonna look like. And every Thursday I feel sick to my stomach because I'm like, oh God, what are they gonna talk about today?
Yeah. Yeah, I have a couple of questions that I was queuing up while you were talking, but since you brought that up, let's jump to that for a minute. What is it, having carried around this case, like literally and metaphorically for the last 15 years, what is that experience like of listening to someone else construct it every week? Is it, like you said, it makes you feel sick to your stomach, but does it, do you, is it an anxious experience? Is it a kind of like logic storm or like rhetoric storm? Like you're ready to kind of like line up all the things that you've thought with the things that they're thinking? Is it maybe like more kind of like emotionally raw to listen to? Is it difficult?
It is. I've been very, very anxious about every episode because, like I said, I don't know who she's interviewed. I don't know what she's heard in the interviews. I don't know what's going to be, and I don't know how it's going to impact conversations that are happening or public sympathy or public support for Adnan. And, I have to keep telling myself, honestly, I'm at a point where I'm getting about 3 or 4 hours of sleep. I can't sleep. I'm so wired. I feel stressed. Mm-hmm. I feel very stressed. But I have to keep reminding, at the end of the day, he was convicted and he has life plus 30 years. So there's nothing that this story, however it unfolds, could really harm him in any real way. You can only go up from here, essentially, for him. Mm-hmm. But it's hard when you hold something personally very dear and you have a really deep personal conviction about it. Mm-hmm. It's like anything, like, for example, if I believe in women's right to choose, right, and I will take very personally people on the other end of that political spectrum, right, and they're attacked or they're characterizing me as a feminazi, or things of that sort. These things can get very personal. So yeah, and this is deeply personal anyway. So, and I believe him. And I listen to people and I'm like, yeah, you haven't met him. You don't know him. You don't even know what's out there, like, what the documents say. So it's anxious. It's hard for all of us. I know my brother and Adnan's brother, all of us who are listening to this are it's hard every week.
Maybe it's good for us to take a quick step back and talk about something that you and I talked about in our first conversation last week. But I guess it's an important kind of argumentative point for me to make. It may seem like blatantly obvious to anyone listening to the show, but at least worth kind of having a little bit of conversation about that. You brought up before, in the environment of this story, you are essentially an activist.
Yeah.
You've been an activist for Adnan's case. It's not like you haven't. It's not like this is the first time that you've really like poured over all of this stuff. You've been doing it for a long time, and you have, as we discussed, you have an agenda, and that Sarah Koenig and her team at Serial, they have an agenda, and it is a different one. Whether somebody likes that or doesn't like that, or whether it's comfortable or not, they are making a piece of investigative journalism, and you're living with the case. And obviously, it's not. I don't imagine that those boundaries don't kind of blur for them and for you sometimes. But it's just worth kind of like recognizing it, and even in the context of these kinds of conversations, like my interest in having this kind of a conversation with you is of a different kind of like more academic and less kind of legal and journalistic perspective. So I think I just wanted to make sure that part of our conversation from last week kind of like shows up in this one that maybe some people will come across, and maybe you could respond to how you feel like that determines their approach to the case versus your approach to the case, or their approach to Adnan's story and your approach to Adnan's story.
Okay, so I mean, I think it's important for me to say first that I really haven't been an activist on this for 15 years.
Okay.
I've been a supporter. Me and my brother, we have just, my family, my parents, my sister, we've just all been supportive of his family and of Adnan. I haven't done any real activism on the case because there's been legal processes ongoing that we've been kind of waiting to go through, but I have always talked to people about it. Like, I lived in Connecticut for 6-7 years. I talked to people in Connecticut. I've had these conversations with so many people about, there's this case and this is what's happening. And so that has been the extent of it. And, it was a strategic decision really not to go to media earlier on. Mm-hmm. Although there were many times I was like, screw it, I'm calling Dateline. Somebody needs to look at this. But there were, some legal strategic reasons not to do that until the post-conviction. So now, however, I think my role is definitely as not even an activist, but an advocate for Adnan. Mm-hmm. And I think that's okay, because I think there's no wrongfully convicted person in the world who wouldn't have gotten out if there wasn't at least one person advocating for it. You have to have that. You have to have somebody who actually really believes you. Right. And so for me, I mean, now as far as like their role, Sarah, I mean, Sarah or Serial, whatever, it's been a process of discovery for me too, because again, I always, I'm like, there's a part of me that's like, I mean, I do believe that on some level, if they didn't think that there was a possibility, maybe not, I don't know, a probability, but at least a possibility that this guy's innocent, that they wouldn't be pursuing the story. Then maybe I'm totally wrong. Maybe it's just a really fascinating story because the teenagers and the Muslim stuff and the, all the weird characters in it, and just the many screw ups. That it's almost like everything that could go wrong went wrong for Adnan at least. So, I have, with every episode I realize that I had to second guess myself too, because I mean, to be honest, there have been times when I've written or blogged or tweeted something, and their folks have said, hey, listen, that kind of, that makes us uncomfortable because, and I had to in my second blog say, listen, I'm totally not aligned with the Serial team. I don't work for them. We don't have the same agenda, because I think it makes them uncomfortable because they want to make sure that what I do is not perceived as something that they're endorsing or that we're aligned somehow. Mm-hmm. But then at some point I had to say, that's great, but you know what? You have your agenda and I have my agenda, and this could come and go.
Mhm.
This attention to Adnan's case can come and go,
Mhm.
and then it'll just be me and us and a couple of boxes of documents again. So, all due respect, I'm gonna have to piggyback on the show and do my best to leverage the attention it's getting. So.
Right, right. Um, yeah, that's that's fascinating to me, and I think it brings up this other point that we talked about last week, and then we'll get into more kind of some specific questions about the sixth episode. But the idea that, and this is what I'd like to hear you respond to, because you've experienced a lot more of this than I have, just as a audience member or a listener. That as people interact with the show, as they listen to it, there's a, obviously for people that that like the podcast format or that are already fans of This American Life, there's an immediate kind of entertainment value to listening to the story. And I mean, we kid ourselves if we don't acknowledge that it is entertaining. It's compelling entertainment. I mean, it's poignant. It's like it does things, but there is an entertainment value to it. And my feeling is, and especially like watching other people interact with it, that to the extent that it remains entertaining to a listener, then the listener kind of remains detached from it, from the perspective of engaging with it in some kind of an online space. And as their kind of personal connection to the story, or their commitment to a specific outcome in the story, then their ability to kind of look at it as entertainment decreases. At least this is certainly true for me, that immediately this story had a kind of personal valence for me, but it wasn't until I started really kind of investing myself in the pieces of it and talking to you about it, that every episode does feel less like reading a comic book and more like reading like a memoir of your family or something like that, where salacious details or courtroom mistakes or whatever really have a kind of like emotional valence to them that they don't have if someone is removed and watching. And so I'm wondering if you've seen, in the people that you've met who are talking about Serial online, I'm wondering if you've seen that balance, if you see that same balance, and if you see it sometimes changing for people.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the entertainment value of it. Like, I understand that that's really the big draw. I mean, it's the way the story's been told, right? I mean, it's the really amazing way the story's been told. I mean, I give full credit to the Serial team for presenting a very complicated story in a compelling and entertaining way. And what I don't know, I mean, it's hard for me to gauge, like when especially, I mean, like, I think for people who will tweet about it once in a while, most of it just seems like they're just kind of entertained. They're like, oh, I'm hooked, I'm addicted. That's like what you see over and over.
Right.
But Reddit is interesting, and some blogs I've seen have some interesting discussions, but Reddit seems to be the community and the platform where people are getting really deeply invested and personal. At the same time, I wonder if the entertainment value wasn't there, would they be in? I mean, they probably wouldn't, right? I mean, so there is this, like, this is like true crime, true detective happening in real time. There's so many elements that are making people, and I know there's a value to that. But me and my brother and Yusuf specifically, we got pulled into a lot of threads on Reddit that got very emotional and ugly quickly, and then we had to kind of amongst ourselves say, listen, we have to really recognize where we are versus where this community and where these people are, and really extract ourselves. So we've kind of really minimized our interaction there now, because first of all, it's weird because people keep seeming to be suspicious about our interaction, whereas we're very open about, this is where we're coming from. We think he's innocent, and this is obviously any piece of the story, we're going to look at it through that lens. But also because at the end of the day, I don't know what difference it'll make. Like, so what if I convince a Redditor or somebody, that he's,
Mm-hmm.
maybe it will, but it's the emotional toll is just too much. And I realize that's because this is not entertainment for us. This is maybe our only shot,
Mm-hmm.
at getting a serious chance of reopening his case.
Mm-hmm. Um, okay, so um, let's go into a little bit of specifically the blog that you put up last Friday about Root Talk and and even the conversations that you and I were having back and forth over Hangout. I think about your interest in kind of like reframing the visuals of the maps and the cell towers and all of that stuff. And anyone who goes back and looks at your post. As with the posts that you've written before, you're always providing a kind of extra second or third layer of court documents and interpretation than the serial team can either wants to or can fit into their time boundaries. So as that intersects with Reddit, here's my question. It looks like there are people on Reddit who helped you solve that question, and I'm curious to find out how that came about. Like, what's the story of how those images on your blog that you credit to people specifically on Reddit, how that happened? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so I remember when after the episode came out, and I was like trying to think about what aspects of it I want to address and what visuals I need. I am really bad at this stuff. Like, I don't know how to Photoshop. I don't know how to do a lot. I don't have the technical skills to create some of these graphics, and that's why I was like, okay, I have Serial has this map. Now I want to just put like the names and the places and the cell tower numbers on the map. And it was like I spent a couple of hours honestly doing it that night, late, like at 1 a.m. I was like, it was terrible. And then I went to my every so often I'll check Reddit because I want to see what the conversation is, but they're also like digging up stuff and coming up with stuff and timelines, and a lot of people there have some great skills. And then I was like, oh my gosh, somebody actually created exactly what I'm trying to do. So that particular map that I put up that has the cell tower numbers and the names, I asked, somebody put it up, somebody created it.
Uh-huh.
I had almost been done creating mine, but mine looked horrible.
Mm-hmm.
So I said, do you mind can I use yours? And they said, in my blog, and they said, yeah, sure. The one with the cell tower radius, I didn't ask, but I should have asked, but I did credit. And afterwards, the person who had created that actually was like, listen, by the way, that visual is not completely accurate because the radius actually goes up to 20 miles, so you might want to indicate that. So going forward, if I'm going to pull something somebody's created, definitely I'm just going to ask if I have the permission. And it's helpful for me because I don't know how to do, I can write about the case, I can pull documents, I just don't know how to do all of this stuff.
Yeah, and I mean you've got a team of people on Serial who are obviously hyper embedded in new media and how to represent these things online. So it's not like that can be your standard. That's not realistic. So then, just to be clear, the images that you pulled into your blog this week were ones that were created without any kind of request or collaboration with you.
Oh yeah, they were already created. Those two, the cell tower radius graphic at the beginning, and then the map. I had nothing to do with the creation of it.
And were those visuals constructed, do you think, from more than just listening to the episode, or was everything that they needed to make those in the episode besides the digital tools?
The map was definitely because the interactive map Serial had up. If you rolled over like the locations, it would give you the information, but it was just that you had to roll over. It wasn't on top of the map. So all that information was there. As for the cell tower radius, that information I don't know if it was. I don't think it was in the episode, and I think people had to do some research to find out what the signal strengths of those towers are. And these people are on it. They're doing all kinds of research, and
right.
It's interesting.
Why do you think they're doing that, Rabia?
I mean, because it's, like I said, it is entertaining, mostly. It's Um, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I mean, honestly, I don't know. I mean, unless I feel like, I mean, for me, unless you have a real conviction one way or the other about the case, like I know he's innocent, and so I have to help. Versus, I think he's guilty, and they're trying to get him out. Like, I don't know what else it could be other than just like something that keeps you entertained or something that, or I don't know. I mean, it's something people are enjoying their time with, I guess. But then there are people on Reddit who definitely have like some expertise and skills, and there's some attorneys who've chimed in. They have some kind of personal interest or professional interest, excuse me. So it's a range of factors, and but what I realized is like after a while, after getting into a number of not so pleasant interactions and some really great ones. I mean, like you can pull up, the history of my commentaries. I try to respond to people when they have questions that I can answer.
Mhm.
Um, is that people are just really, really curious. They're like, I think everybody can tell that, there's a lot that happened here that wasn't apparent in just even the newspaper articles are so sparse from that time.
Mhm. Mhm.
Sparse, nothing there. Um, so I guess people are curious too.
Yeah, that's been that's been something that I've just thought a whole bunch about. Is what I mean, I've always wondered about this, and the more I've kind of my research has kind of veered into new media and crowdsourcing and kind of group thinking, the more I've kind of like really chewed over these details. But this is the first kind of real kind of crunchy digital narrative that has made me start asking questions like that. You say, and we talked about this a little bit last week too. You say I'm really bad at this stuff, the digital stuff. I assume that you mean like anything from like manipulating images on Illustrator, Photoshop, or whatever, blogging, or and even you said when we first started communicating on Twitter that you were even kind of I don't know if I was right about this, if I remember this right, but even that you were kind of new to Twitter or that you hadn't done very much on Twitter. Is that true?
I think I've been on Twitter for about a year and a half or 2 years. I mean, like, so I'm not totally new to Twitter, but I have been using it more in a professional capacity too to talk about. I mean, because none of my work is related to this. Like, none of my professional work is related to criminal defense or any of this. So I've learned the power of Twitter through my actual work, which I explained to you at New America Foundation. I run a program that partners with Google and Facebook to do social media trainings for advocates.
Right.
So I've had to learn kind of how to use some of these tools. But yeah, I mean, for me, the Twitter and Twitter and Facebook, I mean, I can handle those, but I am not that proficient at, like, let's say creating a blog or creating a website. I wouldn't like, it would I would probably be frustrated after a while and just have to hire somebody to do it. But so for me, I was already blogging in a certain space about different issues,
Mm-hmm.
and so I thought, okay, and I had no intention to blog this, none, until the first episode came out.
Right.
And I had been thinking I would write a long form article about it, about kind of the meta narrative, like this is what happened back then, this is how the families dealt with it, this is what's going on. Something long, that I could like submit to the Atlantic, or I don't know what I would do with it, but maybe turn it into a book one day. I don't know, something.
Mm-hmm.
But when I saw when Serial went up and I saw the immediate interaction online, I realized people wanted something immediate. They wanted immediate responses. They didn't.
Mm-hmm.
And so and also I immediately had things I wanted to say.
Mm-hmm.
I heard it. I'm like, oh my gosh, but what about this and this and this? So I just went right to the blog where I blog about other things,
Mm-hmm.
and I just started dropping my blogs there without really giving it any more thought than that.
Right. Do you think I'll come back to that question in a minute, but do you think that that if we think about, again, something that you and I talked about last week, but if we think about um, the history of this case having like multiple narratives, Adnan has the narrative of what he can or can't remember from that day, and the narrative of going through all of this experience, and you and your brother have, and Adnan's brother have that experience, those narratives. Sarah Koenig and her team obviously have made kind of what may sit as the definitive narrative of all of this stuff when it's all over. But as you blog about it, you do your story is different in certain respects. Not that it necessarily contradicts it, but it is a different story, like we talked about, with a different motivation, but also including different information. Do you have a sense that as you're sitting down to blog about it every Thursday night or Friday, that you are changing the story, the kind of collective story, or not? Do you feel kind of like a responsibility on you to shape or steer it a particular way, or are you just kind of like replying, responding, and moving on? Is that question clear?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I think I do feel a responsibility. I mean, how can I be an advocate if I don't elevate a certain narrative out of all of the narratives, right? Like, that's the purpose of an advocate. That's the purpose of even, if you have a good lawyer, that's your job, right? So I do feel a responsibility. At the same time, I feel a responsibility to honor the work that Serial has done. So it's always kind of a negotiation where it's like, I'll upload a document, I'm like, no, wait a minute, I gotta take that down, I can't say it, or I say something and I did. So yeah, I want people to, when they hear Serial, is to then see it through my eyes in a way, like my eyes, or yeah, I guess I can't even say Adnan's eyes, because I don't know, he might look at something very differently, and I'm okay. I mean, I'm completely transparent about that. People are like, oh, you have bias. Well, yeah. I mean, if I didn't, I wouldn't have contacted Sarah to begin with. I mean, I understand what kind of weird allegation that, like. So yeah, I feel responsibility. I don't want to completely respond. I don't want to be just kind of reactive, like, and everything. But in a way, I have to be, because I have to keep limiting myself to what their episode is about. So, that's been kind of tricky and also really frustrating for me. But it's a commitment that I made to myself, that I'm, that for better or worse, I'm gonna, because when it's over, when their show is over, I can put everything I want online. I can put all the thousands of documents I have online. And it makes a significant difference to Adnan's case whether I do it now or whether I do it in a few months. I mean, really. And having said that, there's also some legal things that are happening behind the scenes, and that might have a tremendous impact on where the story goes. And if it goes the way I hope it goes, none of this is going to matter in a way. Well, maybe not. Maybe that's not true. Maybe it'll still matter. But I mean, I don't know. It's yeah, I think it's. What an advocate's job is to shape their narrative, shape the collective narrative, and try to show people like what we're seeing as we're looking at the same things you're seeing. And I'm fascinated looking at reading things that people, like, when they're looking the exact same thing that I'm looking at, like how they're seeing it so differently. It's interesting. Of course, I mean, because it's emotional, I'm just like, no, that's not how it is, but at the same time I have to pull myself back and be rational when I blog about it.
Do you have a sense, Rabia, that there, and things that you're not really able to talk about, but do you have a sense that there is anything that actually could happen for Adnan if, with all the attention that's being put on the case, that the show is putting on the case?
Yeah, I have, because I don't have a background in criminal defense, and so over the years, and the way I came to deciding that I'm going to contact Sarah, or anybody actually, I just randomly picked Sarah, I'll be totally honest, was because I had watched the documentaries on the West Memphis 3, and also all these other cases, wrongful conviction cases over the years, when I've examined how these people who've been behind bars for years finally are released. It's always been kind of either a very dedicated group of legal advocates, or some really major public pressure that that makes it obvious that to the state that something was not done right.
Mhm.
So I think that there is the potential of that happening but I don't know what Sarah has. I just don't know what the team has. I don't know what they've uncovered.
Mhm.
Having said that, again, there's some legal things that are like, I mean, and things are changing. For example, like the cell phone tower evidence as evidence is being re-looked at in different states across the country. So if in certain courts it's being thrown out,
Mhm.
that could be an opportunity for the case to get reopened on the basis that this
Mhm.
much of this case relied on that evidence, which now people are saying is not completely sound.
Right.
So there's, even though when the post conviction was denied, I think that was probably in 15 years the hardest thing, 14 years the hardest thing that happened. Um, there's as long as there are other things to look at, I think there's always hope.
Mhm. Okay. Um, how do you, this will be my last question, then we can kind of start wrapping up. How do you pick the evidence or the information that you're going to throw into a blog post when you're responding to one of their episodes? You have these kind of narrow, kind of laser focus moments, like a couple weeks ago when you found the transcript for the interview with the character that Serial calls Mr. S, the guy who found the body, and you dug up, like the transcript of both interviews with him, one that was a polygraph fail, one that was a polygraph success, and you say, how, like this, like this really casts some suspicion on the idea that this guy passed a polygraph test because the questions were different. Is it always clear as you're listening to the show what evidence you need to go back to kind of rebut certain pieces of the show, or are there like tons of different ways that ideas that you have when you listen to the show and you have to narrow them for some reason because you're thinking about how long people will actually read a blog post or something like that? Can you talk about that process?
Yeah, I mean, look, I might not have a criminal defense background, but I have been a practicing attorney for a long time. So definitely, as I'm listening, I already have like in my head. I mean, it takes me time. I have to absorb it. I have to listen to it. I need a couple hours to just think about it. Think about some of the more salient points that are brought up. And then maybe even look at what people are talking about online to see what people are most kind of compelled by.
Mm-hmm.
But I always immediately have like, oh no, but what about this? But what about this? Because I already know, right? I already know certain things.
Mm-hmm.
Having said that, though, I generally don't know where all those documents are in the thousands of documents. But like for example, with Mr. S, I was like, as soon as I heard that, I'm like, yeah, but I remember the issue with that, and so I had to go back and I had to find it. That took me time. It took me a long time to find those documents to kind of back up my visceral reaction to where they kind of left off on that show.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and it's always hard for me because I don't know if what they're planning to do is maybe in another episode go back and revisit that and say, oh, but this is what happened. But so should I wait? But then I can't blog about anything. So what I try to do is pick like maybe 2 or 3 really like the most important points that jump out at me or that people are talking about that just are related directly to what was talked about in the episode. But almost every single time I realize rambling on my blog and then just taking out stuff because I'm like, I need it to be, it's a blog. I mean, I don't want to read like, all the
Pretty screens.
yeah, right, all the stuff in my head
Right.
also. So yeah, I mean, it takes a lot of self-editing. That's why even though I want to immediately blog on Thursday, I realize realistically it's going to take at least a day for me to think it through, write it through. And every time I do it, it takes at least 5 or 6 hours.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, it's just a fascinating kind of way to think about revision and how a court case is an attempt to revise things, stories that people have, and to is a revision of the case, and your blogging about it is a revision of the podcast. So you know, in every facet, you know, your decision to not kind of wait on this and write about it later, but to kind of blog about it as it's coming out, is a, you know, for me that calls attention to the importance of a new kind of collective revision process that, you know, that really up until, you know, 10 or 15 years ago just wouldn't have mattered. It wouldn't have mattered to have done it now, or 3 weeks from now, or 3 months from now. But right now, like you're living through right now, it matters. It matters if you're able to revise something, because who knows what that revision is going to kind of kick forward into the narrative.
Right. You know, it's important, and I also I put up something late last night because I stumbled across the documents, literally in the same, because, you know, these things, it's like I don't have a catalog of evidence in my head, but I know what I remember, right? Like I know that certain things, I knew certain things that, you know, and I'm like, okay, and then when the whole loosey-goosey doocy whatever that thing was, I was like, man, did I like make that up? Did I really make that up? And so I kind of thought, well, maybe I did. I mean, they weren't huge departures from the truth. So maybe it's been 15 years, you know, and I wasn't a contemporary of Adnan. I didn't go to school with him. I lived out of state, in fact, you know, but I knew him as my brother's friend. So when I saw the documents, I'm like, oh, come on. I mean, it's right there. I mean, I wasn't, you know, so it gave me confidence in the fact that I'm not senile yet, and so yeah. But then I think it's important to say, because that's also craft. I mean, like I have seen it blogged and not tweeted, but blogged and on Reddit so many times now. Well, Rabia is kind of loosey-goosey. Rabia is, even if you go back and listen to the Slate podcast that they just did last week, they're going to say that. They're going to be like, oh, no, wait a minute. It wasn't the Slate podcast. It was some interview with Sarah or something. And the interviewer says, so, you know, she brought this to you, but, you know, Rabia's details were a little bit, you know. And I'm like, wait a minute. You know, I don't want to be thought of like just some crazy old bat.
Right. Well, I mean, it's an example of how a version of a story gets canonized, because I mean, Sarah makes so many little comments as she goes through, and in many ways, I think she makes those comments to demonstrate a certain kind of ethos. You know, like in this last episode, and I listened to it now like more than once. She talks about she's in the car with Dana, and she's saying something, and Dana says something back, and Sarah says, sometimes I think Dana is not really like paying attention to me.
Yeah.
And like, I guess if Sarah has an axe to grind with Dana, she would include that as a dig at Dana, but obviously that's not what's going on. Yeah. She's adding a kind of humor, you know, thing. But once she says anything, that becomes, you know, at least for this online community, that becomes like fact. So, you know,
this is the meme, right? Is it called a meme? This is the meme.
Exactly right. So her entire description of how you know, carried this around for 15 years in your car, and you brought it to her, and you're so impassioned, and she says all these things about you in the beginning about how this is somebody that you don't want to mess with, and all that stuff just goes right out the window for some people when she throws when she throws one epithet or something like that. And one more question I realized, Robbie, as we're wrapping up, and it is, I have a bunch of other ones, but I'm going to save them for next week. Have you spent any time talking to Adnan about the show? Have you guys been able to dialogue about it? And what, is he able to listen to the show? And how does that change the narrative for him that he's in?
So I saw Adnan a couple of weeks ago. He is he used to be in a local prison, and then he got transferred a few years ago to one that's pretty far away, almost like a 2.5, 3 hour drive. So it's gotten much harder to go see. But I went and saw him a couple weeks ago with my brother, his mom. And at that point, I think 2 episodes of Serial were out, and I had blogged a couple of times, but already the Reddit was up, and all these the New Yorker piece had come out, the Guardian piece had come out. So I told him. He has no idea. He had no idea because he can't listen to podcasts. He doesn't have internet. I don't know if he'll ever be able to actually listen to this ever. I described it to him, and this was like the first couple of weeks, so I almost feel like maybe there's a bit of a giddiness in me and the family. We're like, oh, not all this attention. And he was just very measured. He was like, listen, he's like, there have been other cases where it's gotten a lot of media attention, nothing came of it. He's like, but thank you, and I'm hopeful, and he's had to just be patient. He's just had to and after the post-conviction, I think he's really kind of trying to really control his expectations, So at the same time, but he's very grateful for people's interest. So people have started writing him in the mail. People are sending letters to him in the jail.
Mm-hmm.
What I did then when I came back was I actually printed up the transcript for the first couple episodes. I printed up a couple of pages of the Reddit threads, but not the actual conversations, just the threads.
Mm-hmm.
I printed the articles that had come out at that point, and I printed my blogs, and I sent him a whole package so he can kind of see what's happening. But I don't know if he'll still get the same, if he is going to understand kind of the intensity of it, because it's a lot more intense than you can convey with just printed documents. It's such real-time interaction constantly, whether it's online, on Reddit or on Twitter or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I talked to him last week briefly, and but that was not really related to the show. It was related to kind of issues going on with this case and some documents that I wanted to look at, and he wanted me to look at.
Right.
And just catching up on those kinds of things. So yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, there's lots more that I'd like to ask about, but I think it's probably a good time for us to break and get ready for whatever's going to come out this week, and you're writing about it, and my writing about it, and then revisit some of this stuff next week. So I just wanted to again thank you for making yourself available for these conversations, and just kind of an invitation as you go through this next week to put some of these issues kind of in the front of your mind. What I'm calling the meta narrative of Serial, which is this. What is the impact of the story? What is the process of going through the story? How does the story change because of the medium that's being used to convey it? Those are all the things that I'm interested in continuing to talk about, and I appreciate that you're willing to do that with me.
No, thank you so much, Pete, because these are not questions that I've had a chance to really think about. You have to kind of take a step back to look at it, and when you're just in the thick of it and you're thinking about like the particulars of details of the case itself, I haven't been thinking about any of those issues.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't. Now I'm like, should I be blogging it there? I'm like, now I'm considering things that I haven't considered before, and so I appreciate you kind of pulling me back to look at how other people are looking at this. So thanks. I look forward to it.
Okay, good. So we'll see you back next week, hopefully in a live conversation, and I hope that you have a great week. I'll talk to you soon, Rabia.
Thanks. Take care.